You are about to hear a story the world has tried to erase. A story buried under centuries of polite disbelief. A story that whispers in the shadows of history, only to vanish the moment anyone dares to speak it aloud. It begins in a quiet village in England, a place so unremarkable that it never made maps, yet it holds a secret that defies logic, reason, and the very laws of time itself. The kind of secret that, once known, will never leave your mind. In the dead of night, under the pallid gaze of a waning moon, a man appeared at the door of the village's oldest inn. He was gaunt, hollow-eyed, as if he carried with him a weight the world could not bear to acknowledge. He spoke of seeing her. Not some distant legend, not a name etched in the fragile pages of forgotten books. He claimed to have spoken to her, touched her hand, and heard her voice trembling with secrets that had been silenced for 200 years. The villagers, as any reasonable humans would, laughed. They told him he was mad. They reminded him she had died long before any living soul could have known her, that she was gone, and the world moved on, leaving only her grave and the faded ink of history. But the man's eyes, those hollow, unblinking eyes, burned with a conviction that made the laughter die in their throats. There was a truth there, something invisible, yet undeniable, something that shifted the air and made the hairs on their arms stand at rigid attention. What he described could not be dismissed as hallucination. The details were too vivid, too precise, as though he had walked through the veil of time and pulled her into the present. He spoke of a dress embroidered with symbols no historian could decipher, of eyes that held storms older than any living memory, and a voice that carried the weight of centuries of secrets too dangerous to be told. And then, as suddenly as he arrived, he vanished, leaving only a single object behind. A locket, tarnished by time, but inside, a portrait, unmistakably her, alive, and staring straight back at them. Every story, every legend, every history book lies. They are written by those who wish to control the narrative, to keep you blind, to ensure the past remains neatly folded, silent, and obedient. But some truths, they claw their way out, uninvited, uncontainable. And when they do, they demand that you see them, that you acknowledge them, that you follow them, no matter where they lead. This is not a story for the faint-hearted. It is a descent, a journey into a history the world erased because it was too dangerous, too powerful, too real. And it begins with her, the woman who died 2 centuries ago, yet was seen as clearly as if she had stepped out of a mirror in this very room. What you must understand before we go any further is that this is not a simple haunting story. This is a map of power, of control, of manipulation, of the invisible hands that have shaped history in ways you were never meant to comprehend. The man who saw her did not stumble upon her by accident. No, there's a reason so profound that it stretches across centuries, through wars, through secret societies, through the hidden corridors of authority. Her existence, or rather, her lingering presence, was never merely a ghost story. It was a message, a warning, and a key. The village that dismissed him so easily was not ordinary. Every cobblestone, every shuttered window, every mossy grave had layers of observation, layers of secrets that only those who know how to see can detect. He spoke of signs, small but deliberate, the way shadows bent unnaturally, the way the wind whispered in a pattern almost like speech, the smell of ink and decay even where no books existed. Those who walked by the inn later reported a sensation, as though time itself had tilted, as if they glimpsed moments from centuries past led directly on top of their own. And this is where the danger begins. To see her is to open a door that the world's institutions have spent hundreds of years trying to lock. Because once a mind accepts that history is not what it seems, once it begins to recognize the strings pulling behind every official story, it becomes impossible to obey the rules imposed by ordinary life. To know the truth is to become untethered. The man who saw her, he had crossed that threshold, and it left him changed, hollowed, sharpened, like a blade forged in shadows. What he felt, what he feared most, was not her death, nor the impossibility of her existence. It was the knowledge that the reality around him, the reality we all inhabit and take for granted, was a carefully curated illusion. Every institution, every book, every law, every moral guideline, they were designed to contain us, to prevent us from seeing the patterns beneath, to ensure that the powerful remain unseen, untouchable, unchallenged. And yet, there she was, 200 years dead, yet visible. And in her gaze, he glimpsed the architecture of that hidden control. This is why you must listen closely, because the story you think you are hearing is only the surface. The truth beneath it will not simply inform you. It will change you. It will force you to question what you have accepted as reality. And if you are ready, if you are willing, you will begin to see what the rest of the world refuses to acknowledge, that history is not linear, that death is not final, and that the most dangerous knowledge is the kind that lives quietly in the shadows, waiting for those bold enough to confront it. Her life, though long erased from records, was anything but ordinary. The archives that should have documented her existence were meticulously scrubbed, books burned, letters vanished, names crossed out with precision that only the most calculated hands could manage. But she was not just a woman of her time. She was a nexus, a node of knowledge so potent, so dangerous to the powers that be, that history itself conspired to remove her. And yet, she refused to vanish entirely. The man who saw her described her not as a shadow, not as a flicker of light, but as someone who existed simultaneously across time. Her eyes, he said, contained a library of secrets, events that had been altered, truths that had been hidden, people whose lives had been manipulated without their knowledge. She was a living testament to the fact that the world we see is only a carefully staged performance, a play where the actors are ignorant and the playwright invisible. Consider this. What if history, the one we trust, the one we memorize, is not the story of human progress, but the story of human control? What if every war, every revolution, every movement of power was carefully orchestrated to keep certain knowledge hidden? She had seen it. She understood the architecture of influence, the subtle psychological levers that bend minds, the hidden currents that guide nations. And that understanding made her a target. The man told of her voice, low and deliberate, speaking in riddles and warnings. She did not merely communicate. She transmitted awareness. Every word was a key, every glance a map, every gesture a signal of the structures that had been put in place to suppress the truth. And when she died, or when they made sure the world believed she had, she did not leave quietly. She left behind echoes, patterns that ripple through time, waiting for the right eyes to notice. And now, those patterns are reaching you. What you are beginning to perceive is not a story. It is an initiation. Each revelation is a thread, pulling you deeper into a tapestry that the world has worked centuries to hide. To see her, to hear her, to understand her, is to understand the mechanisms of control that surround us even now. She was erased because she knew too much. She was silenced because knowledge is power, and power in the hands of the unprepared is dangerous. This is why men like the one who saw her vanish. Not because she is dead, but because the truths she embodies are alive, and alive truths are dangerous. You are standing at a crossroads. One path returns you to comfortable ignorance. The other plunges you into a darkness that is not evil, but utterly real, and utterly inescapable once seen. To understand why she was erased, you must first understand how erasure works. It is not simply the destruction of documents or the silencing of witnesses. No, true erasure is an art. It is a psychological weapon wielded only by those who understand the fragility of human memory and the malleability of human belief. When they removed her, they did not just wipe her from history. They wiped the idea of her. They engineered a void so absolute that even rumors refused to survive. The man who saw her, he described something chilling, something the villagers refused to speak of afterward. When he mentioned her name, when he tried to recall the details of her face, the air seemed to distort, as though reality itself resisted the memory. His voice would falter. The words would tangle. It was as if something ancient and deliberate pressed against his mind, urging him to forget. Not through fear, but through subtle, calculated pressure. This is how institutional manipulation works. People imagine censorship as big, dramatic acts, bans, fires, raids. But real suppression is achieved through influence, through quiet edits, through whispers, through the slow erosion of truth until nothing remains but an empty placeholder where a memory should be. When they erased her, they ensured no one could even ask the right questions, and those who tried simply stopped trying. And yet she appeared to him. Why him? Why then? Why now? The answer lies in the timing. There are moments throughout history when the system falters, when its grip loosens for a heartbeat and someone slips through the cracks. The man who saw her wasn't chosen by fate. He was simply awake at the precise moment the illusion flickered. And once he saw, he could not unsee. He spoke of a presence watching him afterward. Not his, but something else. Something colder. He felt observed not by a spirit, but by a structure. A force without a face or name, but with a purpose, to ensure that forbidden knowledge stays forbidden. Doors that once opened for him began to close. People acted strangely, as if instructed. Letters went missing. His own journals, pages he never tore, appeared blank. You must grasp this truth. When a power wants someone forgotten, it doesn't merely bury the evidence. It buries the person. It buries the memory. It buries the question itself, until asking it becomes impossible. And yet, here you are, listening to a story they tried to annihilate. Hearing a name that reality itself once refused to hold. This alone means the system has cracked again. And through that crack, you are peering into a darkness that was never meant for you. A darkness that contains not fear, but power, knowledge, awareness, the kind that reshapes a man from the inside out. Before the world erased her, before her name dissolved into the silence designed to swallow it, she was known only by a title, the Archivist of Ashes. A title whispered, not spoken. A title given to her not by royalty or scholars, but by those who understood what she guarded. A collection of truths that were never meant to survive. Truths that revealed not just corruption, but the blueprint of corruption. She wasn't born into power. She was born into obscurity. And yet somehow, by intelligence, by instinct, by an uncanny ability to see the patterns others were trained to ignore, she uncovered the machinery behind her era, the invisible gears turning governments, churches, guilds, and courts. She saw a system older than the empires that claimed to rule, older than the bloodlines that claimed divine right. A system that transcended leaders, outlasted kings, and operated in the shadows, pulling strings with cold precision. She learned something else, something that terrified those who sat behind the curtain. She discovered that influence did not travel through armies or treaties, but through thoughts, through carefully crafted narratives, through the manipulation of what people believed to be history. And once she understood this, she began to trace its fingerprints. She found altered timelines, rewritten events, fabricated heroes, manufactured tragedies. She mapped the lies, and in doing so, uncovered the hands that shaped them. And this made her lethal, not because she sought power, but because she was immune to the narrative. She couldn't be manipulated. She couldn't be controlled. She saw through the illusions that held society together. And for men who relied on obedience, for institutions that relied on blindness, a woman who saw too clearly was more dangerous than any weapon. This is why they erased her. Not because she threatened their rule in the open, but because she had discovered the engine behind the illusion. She had found the archive, hidden beneath a monastery, buried behind walls of false scripture, containing documents that contradicted every major historical account of her era. A vault of forbidden knowledge that could unravel the world if opened. The man who saw her said she spoke of this archive in a single sentence, 6 words that froze his breath and made his blood turn cold. They raised me to erase you. At first he didn't understand, but the deeper he fell into her presence, the deeper he recognized the meaning. If her truths had been allowed to survive, you, the modern man, would not be who you are today. Your values, your fears, your ambitions, your identity itself would have evolved differently. You would have seen through the manipulations passed down from generation to generation. You would have been immune to the invisible architecture that governs your thoughts even now. Her erasure wasn't about the past. It was about controlling the future. The first attempt on her life didn't happen in a back alley or under the cover of night. No, that would have been too crude, too desperate. The forces that targeted her were patient, precise, and confident in their methods. They understood that real control is never loud. It is quiet. It is subtle. It is hidden beneath a mask of civility. And so the first strike came from within the very institution she had once trusted. At the time, she worked as a document restorer in a monastery famed for preserving rare manuscripts. On the surface, it was a sanctuary of knowledge. Beneath the surface, it was a vault, a place where forbidden writings were not preserved, but neutralized, altered, rewritten, sanitized. One evening, as she illuminated a page that had been deliberately smudged to hide a royal confession, she noticed an unfamiliar sigil etched into the corner, a circular symbol with 3 intersecting lines. It wasn't part of the original manuscript. It had been added later, carved so faintly that only someone like her, someone trained to see the invisible, would notice. That symbol would change everything. When she traced it, something shifted in her mind, a pressure, like a hand pressing gently but firmly against her thoughts. She described the sensation later in her journals as the mental equivalent of a locked door that suddenly notices you exist. She had brushed against the boundary of the system, the invisible perimeter that protects the architecture of control. And the moment she touched it, it touched her back. Less than a day later, she fell violently ill during supper. The monk said it was food poisoning. Simple, unfortunate, trivial. But she knew better. The metallic aftertaste, the sudden paralysis of her limbs, the cold sweat dripping down her spine, these were not the symptoms of spoiled bread. This was an extraction, a clean removal, a silent death. What they hadn't accounted for was her mind. While her body failed, her mind sharpened. While poison spread through her blood, her awareness intensified. She realized then that the sigil she had touched wasn't just a mark. It was a seal, a warning to those who could see too much. Crossing it meant crossing into territory reserved for the unseen architects of influence. And they had responded instantly, automatically, like a defense system eliminating a threat. She survived only because an old monk, one who had once been loyal to her mentors, defied the order and gave her the antidote. He whispered 7 words before vanishing forever. They fear what you are becoming. That was the night she understood. They didn't fear her knowledge. They feared the direction her mind was evolving. Because once a person steps outside the story the world tells them, they can never be controlled the same way again. And that realization, that awakening, was the beginning of war. A war waged not with weapons or armies, but with memory, perception, and truth itself. Survival changes a person. But awakening transforms them. After the poison, after the near-death extraction attempt, she no longer moved like a hunted woman. She moved like someone who had finally seen the board from above, the full map, the pieces, the strategies, the hands controlling the pieces, and the motives behind each calculated shift. Her fear didn't vanish. It evolved. It became fuel. It became direction. It became purpose. The first thing she did was dissipate. Not physically. That would have been far too predictable. She disappeared from the version of herself that the institution believed they understood. She no longer followed routines, no longer entered rooms predictably, no longer read what they expected her to read. She became noise in their system, a pattern breaker, a deviation that the machine behind the scenes struggled to analyze. Because here is the truth the powerful never admit. Control systems rely on predictability. They rely on rhythm. They rely on people moving like gears. She stopped being a gear. And the system felt it. She started by returning to the sigil. This time, she did not fear the mental pressure it released. She welcomed it. She allowed it to press into her thoughts, to test her, to evaluate her. Then she pushed back, not with strength, but with clarity, with intent, with awareness. And something remarkable happened. The pressure receded. The boundary shifted. The locked door in her mind cracked open. Behind that door, she perceived fragments, flashes, of the network that watched her. Symbols she couldn't yet decode. Names spoken too quickly to grasp. Movements behind walls. A cold intelligence that studied her not with hatred, but with calculation. She wasn't a threat to be feared. She was an anomaly to be managed. They had underestimated her. They believed she would collapse under pressure, succumb to confusion, lose herself in paranoia. Instead, she began to understand the architecture of the invisible. She began to decipher the logic behind suppression. She began, slowly, methodically, to reverse engineer the mechanisms of power. And then she did something none of them expected. She documented everything. Not in the monastery. Not in journals that could be banned. Not in letters that could be intercepted. She carved notes into thin sheets of wood coated with wax, then melted the wax and hid the wood behind the stones of the cellar walls. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. This was the origin of what later became known, to the very few who ever encountered fragments of it, as the Ashen Codex. A living record of everything she learned, everything she survived, everything she uncovered. It wasn't a book. It was a weapon designed for someone in the future who would be able to finish what she began. Someone like the man who saw her. Someone like you. Because once you hear her story, Once you understand her awakening, something irreversible happens. You start noticing the cracks. You start questioning the narrative. You start recognizing the patterns meant to control you. And the moment that happens, you're no longer a piece on the board. You're a player. The first disruption wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even noticeable to anyone living a normal life. And that's precisely why it worked. She knew the architects watching her didn't fear chaos. They controlled chaos. They feared deviation. They feared anomaly. They feared a mind that refused to obey the gravitational pull of the narrative. Her first strike was aimed at a single document hidden deep within the monastery's forbidden archives, a royal decree that, on the surface, appeared trivial. An old policy granting land to a noble family long extinct. Meaningless, unless you understood what she had discovered, that these decrees were coded messages between the powerful. Not language, structure. Not words, placement. Not ink, patterns of influence. So she changed one sentence. Just one. She altered the phrasing in a way so subtle, so mathematically precise, that anyone reading it would miss the shift, but the system monitoring historical continuity would not. It was like tapping a single key on a vast piano and watching the entire melody rearrange itself. The alteration disrupted a chain of encoded signals that had remained unbroken for over 2 centuries. Within hours, the monastery felt colder. Silence grew thick. Lamps flickered. The elders moved strangely, as if awaiting orders. Every monk felt it, but none could explain it. Something had been triggered, a protocol older than any living man. Something designed for only one purpose, containment. And on that night, they arrived. Not robed monks. Not guards. Not assassins in the traditional sense. These were the observers, men whose faces were always half hidden, whose footsteps made no sound, whose presence felt like a shadow cast before a person even entered the room. They did not speak. They did not threaten. They simply watched, analyzed, calculated. They found the altered document within minutes. They traced its signature, a mental resonance left behind by the person who changed it. Because every alteration to history leaves a fingerprint, a psychic imprint detectable only by those trained to sense it. And her imprint, they realized, carried something they had not expected: clarity, intent, awareness. It terrified them, because people who see the narrative seldom survive long. People who understand the narrative never survive at all. The observers moved through the monastery like a silent plague, locking doors, questioning no one, but forcing everyone into compliance through their presence alone. And yet, when they reached her chamber, they found it empty. The windows sealed, the candles cold. No signs of struggle, just a single sheet of wax on her desk, freshly carved, with 3 words etched deep enough to scar the wood beneath. You notice late. That moment changed everything. For centuries, they had operated under one assumption: that knowledge belonged to them, that surveillance belonged to them, that historians, thinkers, scholars, all of them lived inside the boundaries of their design. But she had stepped outside the design. She had seen the shape behind the curtain. She had rewritten a piece of the structure itself. And the architects realized that they were no longer hunting a woman. They were hunting the first mind in generations capable of breaking the system. Death is simple. Too simple. They realized this after her escape. Eliminating her body wouldn't eliminate her influence. Knowledge like hers survives in echoes, in whispers, in minds she's already altered. So the architects shifted strategies. They turned to a weapon far more effective than blades or poison. A weapon older than any kingdom, any church, any government: psychological inversion. Inversion is the art of making a person doubt their own awakening. It's not suppression. It's not intimidation. It is the systematic reconfiguration of perception until the target believes they were wrong to question anything in the first place. The goal isn't to stop them. The goal is to make them stop themselves. And this is what they unleashed on her. In the days after the observers arrived, the monastery's atmosphere warped into something uncanny. Doors she knew she had closed appeared open. Pages she had written were rearranged. Footsteps echoed behind her with perfect timing, not random, but synchronized with her heartbeat. Candles extinguished the moment she entered a room, as if the air itself rejected her presence. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't even mysterious. It was engineered, orchestrated, designed to fracture her grasp on reality. Because once a mind begins questioning its own thoughts, control becomes effortless. Her journals described the first signs of inversion with chilling clarity. She wrote, "They are not trying to erase what I know now. They are trying to erase who I am when I know it." She would wake in the night and find symbols painted on her walls, symbols she had never seen, yet somehow recognized. She would hear whispers behind her, faint, calculated, repeating fragments of sentences she had written hours earlier. She found her own handwriting in places she hadn't been, found a name carved onto tables she had never touched. This is how inversion works. First they distort your environment, then they distort your memory, then they distort your identity. And when identity collapses, obedience follows. But she didn't collapse. Instead, she did something unheard of. She watched the inversion. She studied it, analyzed it. She recognized patterns in the disturbances, a rhythm, a methodology, a psychological fingerprint of the architects running the operation. Instead of falling victim to the manipulation, she mapped it. She learned its structure. She understood its logic. And once again, she turned their weapon into haze. Because the moment she understood inversion, she understood something deeper, something the architects never wanted anyone to realize. If they can manipulate perception, perception can be manipulated back. That realization changed everything. Because for the first time, the system wasn't the only one rewriting reality. She was rewriting it too. And this was the moment the war shifted from defense to offense. She knew that fighting inversion head-on was useless. You cannot outmuscle a force that operates inside the folds of perception. You cannot punch a shadow. You cannot argue with a thought that wasn't yours to begin with. But she realized something crucial. Inversion relies on synchronization. It requires the system to match her thoughts, her movements, her assumptions, to anticipate her responses before she makes them. And anything dependent on prediction can be disrupted by chaos. So she created a pattern they couldn't follow. Not randomness. True randomness is too easy to detect, too easy to classify. What she needed was something far more sophisticated, a sequence of behaviors that appeared logical but contained no internal logic. She began waking at different hours, but always for a different reason. She wrote on parchment, then switched to stone, then switched to charcoal on her own skin. She spoke aloud to no one, but in perfectly structured sentences. She moved through the monastery as if following a ritual only she understood. The architects monitoring her mind hesitated. She had become noise inside their signal, static in their design. And then she escalated. She inverted the inversion. One night, the night historians would later call the silent interval, she performed a deliberate loop, a walk through the monastery halls in the exact pattern the system expected her to avoid. A pattern so predictable the observers assumed it was bait. But she didn't lay a trap for them. She laid a trap for their assumptions. Because halfway through that calculated walk, she did something that none of their models, none of their psychological frameworks, none of their predictive algorithms had ever accounted for. She stopped, completely, in a corridor lit by a single torch. And she whispered into the air, "You're watching the wrong version of me." The system faltered. The observers didn't move. For 3 full seconds, the longest recorded disruption in their operational history, the architects lost synchronization with her mind. Their influence stalled. Their control stuttered. Their surveillance went blind. And in that tiny window, that sliver of unsupervised existence, she made her real move. She touched a mark carved into the stone centuries earlier, a sigil older than the monastery itself, and pressed her palm against it. A ripple shivered through the walls, like the building exhaled. The stone behind the sigil shifted, and opened. Inside, she found something the architects never intended anyone to access again, a chamber of mirrors. Not glass, metal, polished to a shine that reflected not her face, but her mind. Every fey, every memory, every manipulated thought. The inversion itself, a perfect map of the system's influence on her psyche. They hadn't built this chamber to contain her. They built it to study the human mind, to shape it, to break it, to rebuild it. And now she had access to the blueprint. But the system realized what she had done. And from that moment forward, they no longer watched her as a threat. They watched her as an equal. The next move would not be human. And she would face something no mind in her era had ever survived. There's a moment in every descent where the world around you stops, feeling solid, and starts feeling staged. Where you notice the gaps between what you've been told, and what you can feel pulsing underneath reality like a second heartbeat. When the man who survived the encounter retold what he'd seen, he didn't speak like someone recalling a memory. He spoke like someone reporting a glitch, a break in the script. He said the air around her didn't bend the way air should, that the lantern she carried flickered, but cast no light on the stones, that her feet touched the ground, but left no sound, and yet somehow the entire forest responded to her presence, as if the world recognized her, even if time didn't. Most people forget this truth. History isn't dead. It's only buried, and buried things have a way of moving beneath the soil. When he stepped forward, just to confirm he wasn't hallucinating, he said she turned with the slow precision of a predator. Not frightened, not confused, almost relieved, like she'd been waiting for him. And in that instant, he swore he heard words before her lips even parted. Not spoken aloud, spoken into him, like memory injected directly into the mind, bypassing the senses entirely. Words he couldn't repeat without shaking. Words that felt older than the language he knew. He asked her who she was. That was the mistake. Because entities like her don't answer questions. They give you burdens. She raised one finger, the way a teacher silences a child. And he felt every lie he'd ever been told peel itself open like wet paper. He saw things, moments in history he never lived through. Names of men who weren't recorded in books. Symbols etched onto stone before the pyramids were even drafted in sand. He said it felt like having his mind forced into a shape it wasn't designed to take. Like reality was stretching him thin. And then he blinked, and she was gone. But the world didn't reset. The world stayed, altered. He said that after that night, he could walk into a room and immediately sense who carried generational secrets, who was hiding bloodlines, who had ties to things older than governments, older than scripture. He said it was like gaining a second sight, but losing the safety of ignorance forever. And that's when he realized something chilling. She didn't appear to him by accident. She appeared because he was ready. Oh, because someone decided he had to be. The man tried to return to his old life, routine, predictable, grounded in the comforts of the familiar. But once you've glimpsed what moves behind the curtain, the stage lights don't blind you anymore. Every ordinary moment becomes suspicious. Every silence feels loaded. Every shadow looks like it's hiding something that's simply waiting for permission to step forward. He said the first real sign that something had changed inside him happened 3 days later, in a crowded marketplace. People were moving, bargaining, shouting, just another day. But then he felt it. A subtle tug, like someone plucking a single string inside his chest. Not painful, not loud, just precise, purposeful. And when he turned, he saw her. Not the woman from the forest. Someone else. A girl, no older than 8, standing perfectly still in the path of moving crowds, untouched by the chaos around her. Everyone walked past her without seeing her, like she wasn't truly there. But she was staring directly at him, her eyes too calm for a child, too knowing. And as soon as their eyes locked, he felt that same intrusion, thoughts slipping into him without permission. You saw her. So now you see us. He didn't hear those words with his ears. He felt them, etched inside the mind like a command whispered through bone. He approached her, slow, deliberate, careful. But as soon as he came within a few feet, she blinked, and the entire crowd seemed to shift, like reality took a breath and rearranged its pieces. A woman passed between them for less than a second. When she cleared, the girl was gone. But in her place, on the ground, was a small object. A ring. Worn, ancient, carved with a pattern he couldn't recognize, yet somehow understood. He picked it up, and the moment his fingers closed around it, the world dimmed. Not darker, just quieter, like stepping into a memory that wasn't his. He felt timelines overlapping. He felt history folding. He felt a presence, not his, but something connected to her, pressing against the edges of his consciousness. And for the first time, he understood the truth he had been avoiding. He hadn't stumbled into their world by accident. He'd been marked, initiated, pulled into a lineage of watchers, messengers, and forgotten intermediaries, people without names, without graves, without documented lives. People who existed between time, maintaining secrets humanity was never meant to confront. And now, he was one of them. Willing or not, ready or not, chosen or claimed. From the moment he touched that ring, sleep became a battlefield. Not because of nightmares. Nightmares have logic, edges, a beginning and an end. No. What he experienced were incursions, as if his dreams were doorways, and something on the other side had finally noticed the hinges were loose. The first night, he felt himself falling, but not downward. It was more like being pulled sideways, into a space where gravity didn't know what to do with him. He saw flashes, stone corridors lit by firelight, symbols etched into ceilings too high for human builders, robed figures whispering in a language he had never encountered but somehow recognized. And in every dream, one figure stood apart, face covered, body tall, posture regal, watching him, measuring him, deciding something about him. But here's the part he told no one but the recorder who documented his testimony. At the end of every dream, the masked figure raised a hand, and the moment that hand lifted, he felt pain behind his eyes. Sharp, surgical, like something was being carved into him. Not into the skin, into the mind. When he woke up, he'd find new knowledge sitting in his head like smoldering coals. The geometry of ancient sigils he had never studied. The names of places erased from history. Faces of people who lived before recorded time. And always had the memory of her. The woman in the forest. The impossible woman who should have been dead for 2 centuries. He tried to resist. Tried to ignore the ring. Tried to lock it away. But no matter where he hid it, basement, attic, even buried in a field, it always returned to him. Sometimes in his pocket. Sometimes in his hand. Once, he woke up with it placed gently on his chest. You don't run from things like that. You don't fight them. Not because you're weak, but because you instinctively know they are not operating on a level where resistance matters. Instead, he turned to history, real history, not the curated myth you're fed in schools. He dug into local archives, private collections, restricted libraries, and what he found added a new layer to the fear. 200 years earlier, a woman matching her description disappeared. Not died. Disappeared. Officials claimed she fled the region. Witnesses said she walked into the old forest and never returned. Villagers whispered that she joined the Grey Ones, a phrase no historian could explain, no textbook ever mentioned. But she didn't disappear. She transitioned, crossed, shifted into a role humanity forgot how to name. And the man who saw her had just been inducted into her world, whether he survived it or not. The deeper he went into the archives, the more a pattern began to emerge, like threads from different centuries quietly pulling themselves toward the same invisible center. It wasn't just the woman. It wasn't just the girl. It wasn't just the ring. These weren't isolated anomalies. They were fragments of a system older than any civilization we acknowledge, a system that operates beneath recorded history the way roots operate beneath a forest floor, unseen, but holding everything upright. He discovered that every 200 to 240 years, sightings of a pale woman with a lantern appeared in scattered journals across continents. Not frequent, not public, always whispered, always buried in personal notes, family accounts, or documents smuggled into private collections. Her descriptions were eerily consistent, tall, silent, ancient garments, movements that felt precise but not human, and that strange quality of presence, like she came from a layer of reality just slightly misaligned with ours. The reports always ended the same way. The witness changed. Some vanished. Some became wondrous. Some became scholars obsessed with forbidden knowledge. And a handful, just a handful, rose to positions of influence so deep they effectively shaped entire generations without ever being named in official records. They were called inheritors in one set of documents, transcripts in another. But the oldest name he found was carved into a clay tablet locked in a museum vault, a tablet he only saw through a smuggled photograph. The carriers of the unfinished light. At first glance, it sounded poetic, but he understood the implication immediately. They weren't chosen to protect something. They were chosen to continue something. Something she, and others like her, had begun long before his lifetime. And then he noticed another pattern, one that made his hands shake as he read. Every witness who saw her alone, always alone, which meant she wasn't appearing at random. She was selecting, testing, recruiting, and the girl in the marketplace, that was confirmation, a second emissary, a second intelligence evaluating him, calibrating him, judging whether he was capable of carrying whatever they were building. But the most disturbing realization came from a document so fragile it looked like dust held together by regret. A line written by a man who lived centuries earlier. When the lantern-bearer appears, she does not arrive from the past. She arrives from the future we were never meant to reach. He read that sentence over and over, because it meant everything he thought he understood about her was wrong. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a memory. She was a messenger from a timeline humanity abandoned, or was forced to abandon. And she came to him because time itself was starting to fracture, and someone needed to be prepared for what breaks through first. He didn't tell anyone this part at first, not the researchers, not the recorder, not even the people who later tried to classify him as psychologically compromised. He held it back because it felt too dangerous, too revealing, too close to the core of what was truly happening. But eventually, he confessed. The night after he read that impossible line about her arriving from a future humanity was never meant to reach, he woke to a sound. Not outside his house, not inside his room, inside his head. A faint humming, like a mechanical chant wrapped in something organic, something alive. It wasn't painful, but it was unmistakably foreign. He sat up in bed, sweating, breath sharp, pulse racing. Then he saw it. A shape, just a silhouette, standing in the corner of the room. Tall, unmoving, watching. Not her. Someone else. The same masked figure from his dreams. Only this time, it wasn't a dream. He tried to speak, but his voice felt swallowed, as if sound had been muted at the source. He tried to move, but his limbs locked into place, commanded by something he couldn't understand. The figure stepped forward, not walking, but gliding, as though the floor had been erased beneath it. And then the mask tilted. A small angle. A subtle gesture. But one with the weight of authority so ancient it crushed every instinct he had. That's when he realized something that almost broke him. Entities like these weren't bound by time. They weren't bound by space. They weren't bound by the biological limits that make humans predictable, fragile, and easily controlled. They existed in layered realities, moving between them the way a reader flips pages in a book. And he was now a page. The figure reached out one hand, not touching his skin, but hovering just inches from his forehead. The air vibrated, like frequencies collapsing into a single note. His vision blurred, then sharpened. He felt pressure, not physical, but mental, like something was scanning him, evaluating the architecture of his mind, measuring his resilience, mapping his weaknesses. And then, without warning, the figure withdrew. The pressure vanished. The humming stopped. His body unlocked. But before disappearing, before dissolving into the dark like smoke losing its coherence, the masked figure whispered a single phrase directly into his skull. Prepare for the convergence. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it wasn't a warning. It was an instruction, a command. A countdown begun. After that night, he stopped pretending he could return to normal life. You can't go back to sleep once you've heard the architecture of reality humming behind your thoughts. You can't unsee the figures that move through the seams of existence as if those seams were doors built only for them. But there was something deeper, far more unnerving, than the visit itself. He realized the figure hadn't come to frighten him. It had come to verify him. Like a final assessment. A last examination before entry. He began noticing subtle shifts in his perception over the next few days. Crowds no longer felt like collections of people. They felt like layered networks of signals, half-conscious minds broadcasting emotions, fears, and impulses like radio static. He could feel when someone was lying. He could feel when someone carried generational pain. He could sense when someone was being moved by influences they didn't understand or acknowledge. At first, he thought it was paranoia. Then he realized it was pattern recognition. Patterns he had never been trained to see, but were now impossible to ignore. He'd walk through a public space and feel the presence of individuals who didn't quite fit the flow of the environment, people whose eyes moved differently, whose posture wasn't driven by habit, whose awareness stretched further than the average mind. They noticed him too. Subtle glances, faint nods, micro-recognitions, almost like they saw the mark he carried, the same way wolves identify another predator in the tree line. That's when he understood something chilling. There were others. Not many, but enough. Some older, some younger, some embedded in society with positions that granted influence without attention. They were scattered, strategically, quietly, like a network seeded across countries and cultures. They didn't gather. They didn't speak openly. They operated like ghosts wearing human faces. And they all carried the same silent imprint. The same selection. The same induction. The more he observed, the more he felt the world shifting. Not dramatically. Not violently. Just subtly. Like a chessboard being rotated a single degree each day. Imperceptible in the moment, but impossible to deny once enough days pass. New symbols began appearing in his dreams. New languages whispered in the space between thoughts. And always, always, that phrase echoing from somewhere just beyond the limits of comprehension. Prepare for the convergence. He tried to decode it, dissect it, track its meaning through historical references. But nothing human matched it. Until the night he realized the convergence wasn't an event. It was a merger. A merging of timelines. Of realities. Of identities. And it had already begun. The realization hit him not as an idea, but as a physical jolt, like a memory returning that never belonged to him in the first place. He was standing at his kitchen sink when it happened, hands under running water, mind drifting. And then, just for a fraction of a second, the world around him flickered. Not the lights. The world. The edges of his vision brightened, stretched, and then snapped back into place. It felt like reality had skipped a frame. Like a film reel where one strip of time was replaced by another. And in that fraction of a second, the kitchen wasn't a kitchen. The walls weren't the same color. The furniture was gone. The air smelled like old stone and burning herbs. And he wasn't alone. There were figures standing around him. Tall, robed, silent. Watching him as though he were the anomaly. As though he were the apparition trespassing into their reality. Then the flicker ended. Everything returned. The sink. The water, the quiet, and his pulse, hammering like fists on a sealed door. That was the moment he understood what the masked figure meant. The convergence wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't philosophical. It was literal. Realities, timelines, layers were beginning to overlap, and he was slipping between them like someone caught between two versions of the same dream. Once he accepted that, more distortions followed. He'd walk past a mirror and see a version of himself half a second out of sync. Not delayed, replaced. His reflection would turn its head a little faster, eyes a little sharper, posture a little more confident. A version of him who had already embraced what he was becoming. A version molded by the very forces now shaping him. Sometimes, when he blinked, he swore the reflection smacked. Shadows behaved strangely too. They elongated where light didn't reach. They curled along walls like they were climbing toward something. And at night, he began hearing whispers, not external, not internal, somewhere between the two. Ancient languages, familiar rhythms, instructions he couldn't decode but felt compelled to follow. And then, late one evening, while staring at the ring, still refusing to take it off, he heard her voice again. Not behind him, not in front of him, inside the convergence. Your identity must fracture before it can evolve. He froze, breath held, eyes wide, because he understood what she meant. The man he used to be couldn't survive what was coming. He had to shed that identity like old skin. If he didn't, the convergence would tear it off for him. He tried to hold on to who he was. He really did. He wrote his name on paper to anchor himself. He repeated old memories just to feel something familiar. He even recorded his own voice, playing it back late at night like a lifeline thrown into a rising tide. But the truth was brutal, undeniable, and unavoidable. His identity was dissolving. Not emotionally, not psychologically, existentially. He described it like this. Imagine your sense of self as a house you've lived in your whole life. You know where everything is. You know every sound, every creak, every shadow. Now imagine waking up one morning and realizing the house is still there, but the walls aren't in the same place anymore, and someone keeps adding rooms you don't remember building. That's what the convergence was doing to him, expanding him, stretching him, rewriting him. When he walked through the city now, he no longer saw it as a physical place. He saw it layered, like multiple transparencies stacked on top of each other. The buildings had echoes. The sky had memories. Sometimes he'd stare at a street corner and feel overwhelming déjà vu, not because he'd been there before, but because another version of him, another branch of himself, had stood in the same spot in a different timeline. And that version had made a decision he had not. He felt that decision like pressure in his bones. A pull. A calling. A demand. Then came the night when everything shifted again. He was sitting in a dimly lit room, staring at the ring glowing faintly on his finger. His thoughts felt distant, stretched thin, like his mind was pulling away from his body. He blinked slowly, trying to steady himself. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't alone. She stood in front of him. The same woman he'd seen in the forest. The impossible woman who shouldn't exist in his timeline. Her lantern didn't illuminate the room. It illuminated him. Every flaw, every fay, every fragment of identity cracking under the weight of the convergence. She didn't speak with her mouth. She spoke with her presence. You resist because you fear losing yourself. But the self you cling to was never the truth. His throat tightened. His vision blurred. His heart felt like it was being recalibrated. Then she leaned closer. So close he could feel the cold of a century he never lived through. The man you were must die, so the one you were meant to become can rise. And in that moment, he knew identity wasn't something he was losing. Identity was something he was being transformed into. He understood, with a clarity that terrified him, that transformation was not optional. The convergence didn't wait for permission. It didn't negotiate. It didn't care about comfort, morality, or fay. It simply acted. And if he refused to act alongside it, the convergence would act on him, force him, fragment him, override him, until what remained was no longer human. The first sign of irreversible change was subtle. He woke one morning and realized his memories weren't lining up. Events he remembered clearly had never happened, or had happened differently. He could recall conversations he never had, places he never visited, and yet the emotions attached to those experiences were undeniable. It was as if multiple lives were bleeding into him simultaneously. And Weiss, he started sensing threads, people he hadn't met, decisions he hadn't made, dangers he hadn't faced. All of it layered inside his awareness like an algorithm he hadn't written but was forced to run. Then came the visions. Not dreams. Not hallucinations. They were slices of time pulled from the convergence itself. Sometimes he'd see cities as they were before being built, then centuries later, then in versions that might exist if the timelines were allowed to collide. Sometimes he'd see faces he recognized but shouldn't, watching him silently from corners he never occupied. And always, somewhere in every vision, she was there. Always watching, always guiding, always waiting for him to break through the human shell and step into the something beyond it. One night, exhausted from the relentless intrusion of overlapping realities, he awoke to a phrase echoing in his mind. Not heard, not read, felt, embedded in the marrow of his bones. To network of architects could trace him, anticipate his movements, and escalate their interventions. He was no longer a passive witness. He had entered the game, and the game had already begun to escalate. The first confrontation didn't arrive as a figure stepping out of the dark. It arrived as an absence, a sudden hush in the air, as if the world inhaled and forgot how to exhale. The forest around him froze, not metaphorically, but with an almost mechanical precision, like gears locking in place. Leaves hung suspended mid-fall. Wind halted, severed from motion itself. Even the distant calls of night creatures cut off in an instant, leaving a silence so complete it felt engineered. He recognized the sensation immediately. This wasn't nature. This was intervention. A perimeter had been formed around him, an isolation field used by the architect's most elite agents, designed to remove a target from the timeline long enough to correct him. Then he saw them. 3 silhouettes materialized at the edges of the frozen forest. Not walking, not emerging, but loading into existence, as if reality itself had been overwritten to place them there. Their forms flickered slightly, like poly-rendered memories, tall, genderless, each wearing a cloak etched with geometric patterns that moved as though alive. No faces, no features, only a single mark on each mask, an inverted circle burned into the surface. The closer they came, the heavier the air grew, pressing against him from all sides. They weren't approaching physically. They were collapsing his reality into theirs. Their thoughts pressed into his skull like cold needles. And in those wordless intrusions, he sensed their purpose: to reclaim the codex, to erase the anomaly he had become, to restore the order he had disrupted. He took a step backward and realized something horrifying. His body resisted him. Not from fear. This was external. They were attempting to rewrite his motor impulses before they formed. His limbs felt foreign, sluggish, like software struggling against a forced update. He reached for the codex, not with his hands, but with his mind. Its symbols burned behind his eyelids, glowing like coals snapped awake. He focused on a single diagram, one he had barely begun to understand, a counterthread meant to fracture containment fields. The moment he invoked it, the forest shattered back into motion. Leaves dropped. Wind roared. Time snapped like a whip. The agent staggered, just slightly, but enough. Their masks cracked, thin fractures spreading like ice. For the first time, he heard something from them. Not speech, not thought, but a low, resonant hum that shook the ground. They were recalibrating, adapting, evolving. The codex hadn't destroyed them. It had only revealed their true form beneath the illusion. And now, fully awakened to his presence, they advanced. The agents moved differently now. No longer human proxies, no longer shadows flickering at the edges of perception. They advanced as distortions of reality itself, warping space around them, bending light, compressing sound. With every step, the air thickened, a physical weight pressing down on him, threatening to crush his lungs, his thoughts, even the stability of his identity. He could feel the convergence responding, like a tide against a cliff, relentless and inevitable. He raised the codex, or rather, the space where it existed. The air shimmered, pulsing with the memory of its symbols. Every sigil he traced in his mind sent waves outward, a psychic shock into the agent's field of influence. One of them reached for him, not with hands, but with intention, and he felt it, like thousands of invisible needles pricking the neural pathways of his consciousness. This was the first real, direct assault on his mind. Their goal wasn't to kill his body. They could do that easily, but to override his consciousness, to merge him into the order they had maintained for centuries, to remove his autonomy entirely and make him part of the architecture he had dared to challenge. He faltered, just for a moment, enough for doubt to creep in, enough for the whispers of his old identity, the one he had clung to for centuries, to rise and cry out for safety. And then he remembered her words, the ritual, the phrase he had repeated twice, "I see beyond. I see beyond." This time, he added something he had never spoken aloud before. "I command the fracture." The codex responded instantly. The air erupted in a silent storm of energy. The sigils glowed, threads of time and space intertwining around him like living chains. The agents staggered, distorted forms flickering, one of them even screaming, a sound that wasn't meant to exist in the physical world. He felt the first surge of power the codex offered, not brute force, but the ability to bend reality in alignment with his perception. He realized something terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time, he could interact with the convergence directly, shaping the architecture of history, even if only in micro-increments. But with that realization came clarity. Every action, every thread he touched, every subtle manipulation carried risk. One misstep, and he would fracture irreparably, body, mind, identity, all consumed by the system he was now challenging. And he knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the war. A war not fought with weapons, but with perception, influence, and control over the unseen forces shaping humanity itself. And the architects were mobilizing their full power against him. The forest cleared into a space he didn't recognize. Not entirely, anyway. It was circular, bounded by towering stones etched with symbols that thrummed faintly under his skin. The air smelled of iron and smoke, though there was neither in sight. It was a sanctum, a nexus point between the layers of reality the convergence was maging. And at its center stood figures, 6 of them, cloaked, masked, and immobile, each exuding a presence older and heavier than anything human. These were custodians, the hidden lineage she had left behind. Not sentinels, not guardians in the common sense, but keepers of thresholds, arbitrators of knowledge, and executors of history itself. Each one radiated a different authority, one over memory, another over perception, one over chronology, another over influence, one over suppression, and the last, the oldest, over the codex itself, over the architecture of manipulation that had spanned millennia. He felt the weight of their gaze, though none of them moved. It pressed into him like the accumulation of every expectation humanity had ever held for obedience. He realized instantly why few ever reached this level of awareness, To see them was to confront not just the architecture of history, but the architecture of humanity itself. The oldest custodian spoke first, not with a voice, but with thought, echoing in the spaces between his neurons. You carry the fracture. You have observed beyond what mortals perceive. But observation alone is not enough. You must learn to navigate the threads, to weave intention through reality without breaking the pattern that sustains existence. Every word felt like an incision, a precise cut into the structure of his consciousness. He understood that their purpose was dual. They tested him, yes, but also educated him, training him to perceive, to influence, to survive in a space where reality was fluid and obedience was lethal. Then another spoke, the one governing perception. The architects know you have touched the codex. They will escalate. They will probe your identity, your memory, your fears. Only by mastering yourself can you survive the assault. Only by accepting your fracture can you command it. He realized that the convergence wasn't just an event he was part of. It was a curriculum. Every vision, every distortion, every encounter with shadows and agents was a lesson. Every trial was designed to fracture him further, but also to equip him. And then he felt it, a shift, subtle at first, like a tremor beneath his consciousness. The codex pulsed. The architects were coming. Their elite had located him. The custodians did not move. They simply observed. Because this next encounter would not only test his perception and strength, it would test his soul. He barely had time to register the shift before the air itself screamed. Not literally, not with sound, but with the sensation of displacement. The ground under the sanctum rippled as if the stones were floating in water. Time began to hesitate, moments stretching, compressing, folding back upon themselves. He knew instantly, the architect's elite had arrived. They didn't enter as men or machines. They entered as events, as distortions, as the invisible weight of consequence made manifest. The custodians remained statuesque, their presence an anchor, but even they seemed to ripple slightly under the tension. He felt it through every fiber of his body, the pressure of innumerable timelines pressing down, the convergence intensifying, testing his stability. And then they appeared. Not fully formed, not human. Glimpses of their shapes flickered in and out like broken memory. The cloaks of shadow moved independent of gravity. Their eyes, or what he assumed were eyes, were voids that reflected multiple realities at once, impossible for the mind to comprehend. They radiated control, the kind that bends thought, perception, and action without a word. The first wave moved toward him. He felt their intention before their presence fully manifested, a push at the edges of his consciousness, probing for hesitation, doubt, fear. One false move and they could rewrite his mind entirely, erase him from the threads he had begun to weave. He steadied himself, remembering the phrase, the ritual, the fracture. I see beyond. I see beyond. Twice. And this time, he added the codex's pulse, letting its hidden resonance flow through him. It was not magic. It was architecture. Mechanism. Awareness. Power. The first agent struck, not physically, but psychologically. Memories twisted, doubts injected, fears amplified. He felt his identity splintering, old fears erupting with impossible intensity. But he responded with perception, tracing the thread of their influence back, unraveling it before it could root. He redirected the pressure, letting it flow around him instead of into him, forcing the agent's distortion to recalibrate. One staggered. One faltered. One vanished entirely, erased momentarily by the codex's counterthread. He realized in that instant, the confrontation wasn't about strength. It was about clarity, control, precision. Every thought, every impulse, every hesitation could be a weapon, or a trap. The sanctum trembled as the convergence intensified, a reminder that the boundaries between timelines, realities, and identities were thinning. And he understood, with both dread and exhilaration, this was only the beginning of the architect's full-scale response. The next wave would be more than perception. The next wave would test the limits of his very existence. The second wave arrived like a storm made of absence and thought. He didn't see them first. He felt them, ripples in the fabric of his consciousness, shadows in the spaces between neurons. These agents were no longer constrained by form or proximity. They infiltrated memory, perception, even instinct. Every movement he made seemed anticipated before he thought it. Every impulse mirrored and counted. The sanctum itself responded. Stones vibrated, glyphs glowed like veins of living light, and the air thickened until breathing was an effort of will. The custodians remained statuesque, silent witnesses, as if the arena had become his responsibility entirely. They could intervene, but this trial required him to act alone. He reached for the codex, not physically, but mentally, feeling its threads coil around his consciousness. Symbols pulsed beneath his skin, embedding themselves into his neural pathways, teaching him to anticipate the distortions before they manifested. He realized, to survive this wave, he could no longer exist as the man he had been. He had to fracture fully, to dissolve into the codex's architecture and let it flow through him. The agent struck, each pulse a strike against his mind. Fear, doubt, and memories of his old life were weaponized against him. He felt himself bending under the pressure. Then he invoked the ritual aloud. I see beyond. I see beyond. I command the fracture. Twice. And this time, something extraordinary happened. The codex responded, not as a passive tool, but as a living ally. Its energy wove through him, layering his fractured identity over the threads of reality itself. He could see the distortions forming in real time, trace them like rivers, redirect them, even partially neutralize them. His perception was no longer human. It was architectural. One agent screamed in a sound that had no business existing in three-dimensional space. Another faltered as a reflection of itself appeared inside the convergence, trapped in its own loop. The last tried to collapse his mind from the inside, but he met the assault with precision, countering thought with thought, intention with intention. Time snapped back. The air settled. The forest shimmered as if reality exhaled. For the first time, he realized, the codex didn't just give knowledge. It gave agency. It made him not merely a participant in the convergence, but a player capable of influencing the architecture itself. Yet even as he caught his breath, he felt it, a pulse beneath all layers of reality. Stronger, deeper, ancient, waiting. And he understood, with a chill that ran through every fractured fragment of himself, the convergence was not ending. It was accelerating. And the final trial had yet to begin. The final trial arrived not with sound, not with form, but with inevitability. He felt it before he saw it, the weight of all timelines, all realities, all suppressed histories pressing down at once. The codex pulsed in response, resonating through every fragment of his being. This was no longer a test of perception or resilience. This was a reckoning. From the center of the sanctum, a presence emerged. Not human, not shadow, not even fully tangible. It was older than the architects, older than the custodians, older than the histories humanity had forgotten. He sensed it in the marrow of his bones, in the pulse of the codex beneath his skin, the force orchestrating the convergence itself. It was everything he had glimpsed in fragments, the woman, the shadows, the architects, the suppressed civilizations, all drawn together into a singular intelligence. It regarded him, not with malice, not with curiosity, but with judgment. And in that judgment, he felt the weight of his entire identity, the man he had been, the fractured self he had become, the amazing self the codex was shaping. He realized, survival required more than awareness. It required merging. Not assimilation, not surrender, but a synchronization of intent with the hidden currents of reality. Every skill the codex had taught him, every fracture endured, every thread perceived, had led to this moment. He reached inward, into the core of the codex, and outward, into the layers of converging reality. He fractured, dissolved, and reformed simultaneously. Doubt, fear, memory, identity, they all flowed through the codex, interwoven, strengthened, and sharpened. The presence responded, testing, probing, aligning. And finally, it allowed a tether, a connection, bridging human will with timeless architecture. He opened his eyes, and the sanctum stretched beyond the forest, beyond the earth, beyond time itself. The distortions, the agents, the timelines, they all rippled in harmony around him. He saw the threads that guided history, the manipulations of power, the hidden frameworks of civilization. And for the first time, he realized the full magnitude of the truth she had entrusted to him. To perceive is not enough. To survive is not enough. One must command. To wield understanding without fear. To navigate deception without surrender. to fracture and reconstruct oneself in the crucible of the unseen. The presence receded, acknowledging mastery without words. The convergence stabilized, but not ended. He had passed, yet the flow of reality remained alive, and he was now a living instrument within it. He was no longer simply a man. He was the fracture. He was the observer. He was the inheritor. And the world, as humanity knew it, would never be the same. The woman from the forest, the girl, the codex, the custodians, they had vanished from sight, but their imprint remained, etched in him. And from this point forward, he would carry the forbidden truth, the hidden currents, and the power to shape what history would remember, and what it would forever erase. The convergence had begun, and he was ready.